Some say that the IRS has been underfunded and that using names and political briefs to target these 501c4 applications for additional scrutiny was just a shortcut to deal with the growing number of tax-exempt applications. These shortcuts, however, started in 2010, when the number of 501c4 applications were basically static and the total number of applications for tax exemption were going down. And the funds appropriated to the IRS in 2010 were not only a record high amount, but it's also the second consecutive year that funds appropriated to the IRS actually exceeded the budget request of the IRS. And so doesn't it seem counterintuitive or seem strange that the IRS had less work to do and more money than ever to do that work, that they would decide to take these shortcuts? And in addition, sending abusive letters and asking for unnecessary information from these applicants doesn't sound like a shortcut to me. And so now we learn of the flagrant waste of taxpayers' dollars on conferences and videos, and the money came in part from the unused funds from the IRS enforcement budget. At the same time, the IRS was asking for more money for enforcement so they could catch the so-called tax cheats. Now for 2014, the IRS budget request is for $12.9 billion. That's a $1 billion increase over the current year, and of which $440 million is to help implement the so-called Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare. Now, even before the Inspector General's report was released, any kind of increase of this magnitude was going to be a challenge for some very basic reasons. Number one, there are a lot of objections to affordable health care, a lot of objections to Obamacare. The subcommittee has limited money. We all know that. We're looking at this breach of trust that we're talking about today in this terms of this scandal. And now we have this newly discovered incredible waste. So we're going to have to think very carefully about the amount of money that we provide to the IRS. Now, nevertheless, I think we know this. We need to fund this agency so it can accurately answer questions from businesses and individuals about tax matters. It needs to produce tax forms and instructions that promote compliance. It's got to process tax returns in a timely manner, and it's also got to investigate the criminals that are committing tax fraud. However, we cannot in good conscience continue to provide hard-earned taxpayers' dollars to the IRS and have them use those funds to abuse the rights of American citizens. And we can't continue to provide the IRS with money and watch them so flagrantly waste those dollars. Now today we're going to take testimony from Acting Commissioner Daniel Werfel and Treasurer Inspector General J. Russell George. And I hope that we'll hear a little bit how we're going to get to the bottom of all this, how we're going to prevent this from happening again. But here's some things I can tell you already. We're going to insist that the IRS implement all 9 of the recommendations in the Inspector General's report to the satisfaction of the Inspector General. We're going to require more frequent and in-depth reports from the IRS about how they allocate their funds among their different offices. And we're also going to demand that the IRS demonstrate to the committee that the funds provided by this committee are used without a hint of partisanship or ideology when it comes to the application of the tax laws. Now, this hearing is Inspector General's second appearance before the subcommittee this year. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us again. This is Mr. Werfel's first congressional hearing in his new role as Acting IRS Commissioner. I want to congratulate you, if that's the right word, on your appointment. And thank you for taking this assignment at a very difficult time. We appreciate your service. And finally, let me say that this committee expects the witnesses to be candid and forthcoming. If additional information about the practice of targeting or other topics discussed here today comes to light after the hearing, we expect General George and Mr. Werfel to keep this committee apprised of the latest information. Now, I want everybody to have a chance to ask questions today, everybody to have a chance to have those questions answered, so I'm going to keep strict time in order to keep the hearing moving. We want to get as many rounds of questions as we can. But right now, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Serrano, for any opening statement he might like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, welcome our guests to this hearing today. I think all members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, were appalled by the inappropriate actions taken by the IRS in determining how to examine the tax-exempt status applications of various groups. The delays in processing applications, the criteria used for further review, the information asked for, indicates an organizational failure that is simply unacceptable. The IRS is supposed to administer our tax laws in a fair and impartial manner. Anything else, and the agency loses the confidence of the American people. The IRS has not helped the situation with a seeming lack of clarity and forthrightness with Congress on these issues. In March of 2012, this subcommittee was told in no uncertain terms that the IRS was not targeting particular groups for further scrutiny, and that there were several safeguards in place to prevent biased or unfair examination policies of 501c4 organizations. Both of these answers were terribly wrong then, and they're terribly wrong now. While the information we have now does not indicate that Commissioner Schulman believed these responses to be anything less than truthful at the time, no subsequent effort was made to ensure that this committee knew that there was more to the story, especially in subsequent months when the leadership of the IRS became aware of these problems. In other words, when you folks at the agency knew that things had changed and were not the way we were told, no one came back to tell us. This past weekend, we all read press reports about excessive conference spending at the IRS. The lack of oversight and accountability in both of these areas seems to point to larger cultural issues at the IRS. Many of these issues have been well documented by the Inspector General, George, and in several committee hearings over the past few weeks. Today, we ask the next question: what do we do now? I'm not sure we have an easy response. We clearly need to reform the process by which 501c4 organizations are chosen for further review. We need to provide more guidance as to what is and is not allowable for 501c4 organizations. And we need greater accountability in the IRS management structure to ensure safeguards are in place to prevent this type of behavior. We also need to do more research. The current Tic-Tac report provides us with important analysis into the problems, but I was struck by how much more we need to find out. We all know that some one-third of the organizations that receive further scrutiny here were chosen for that review based on their organization title. However, we still don't know how much about two-thirds of the organizations caught up in the process. Beyond the recent incidents, I remember that these same complaints were leveled at the IRS during the Bush administration by groups that were opposed to the war in Iraq. Clearly, this is an issue that has spanned a number of years, and this latest scandal is only the most recent one that we know about. I think we would all benefit from a longer and more in-depth look at the actions within the tax-exempt and government entities division over a number of years and a number of administrations. Third, we need to have a serious discussion about funding levels at the IRS. This subcommittee has been given an allocation of $16.9 billion for fiscal year 2014, which is almost $3 billion below the current sequester impacted level. Undoubtedly, this is going to result in massive cuts to the IRS and many other federal agencies. While there are certainly efficiencies that can occur, the conference spending issue comes to mind. The IRS simply cannot sustain itself with this overall funding level. Although I am certain there are some who will view this as a good step, I disagree. There is no clearer way to promote more scandals than by cutting funding that could be used for oversight, training, and reform. At the level this subcommittee is funded right now, we are just asking for more trouble at the IRS and elsewhere. Lastly, we need to have a conversation about why we allow groups who are primarily involved in politics to have a special tax advantage status. I think it is clear that we have a number of groups on both sides of the political spectrum that have abused their tax status as either 501c3 or 501c4. Freedom of speech certainly does not require these groups to be tax advantaged. We need to ensure the integrity of both our tax system and our political system, and the current practice allows abuses of both. One step we should consider is to return to a previous standard for 501c4 applications, which until 1959 were required to be operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. This would ensure that organizations could no longer take advantage of the tax code in order to engage in political activity without the transparency required by our campaign finance laws. As I said earlier, none of these questions have any easy answers. And I hope that today, after we look at the report, after we hear the answers to the questions, we can begin to move in the proper direction. And let me just end on a very personal note, Mr. Chairman. I am second to no one in this Congress in asking for more funding for the IRS. And so it hurts me both as a representative of the American people, a member of this committee, and personally, that while I and others stood to support the IRS, it was not doing what it was supposed to do. I don't care who the groups were. No one should have been targeted. No one should have been singled out for any bad treatment. That is not the way the IRS should behave, and that is certainly not the way our country should behave. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. And we're joined today by the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Rogers. I'd like to recognize him for any opening statement he might make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for hosting this session. We want to thank Commissioner Werfel for making your first appearance on the Hill inauspiciously. And Mr. George, thank you for being here again with us. I want to echo my colleagues' deep concern about the targeting scandal and other inappropriate spending at the IRS. The IRS has committed grave violations of the public's trust that should give all Americans cause for deep concern. Today we're discussing at least a threefold misuse of public funds. It's our duty as appropriators to get to the bottom of any misuse of federal dollars, particularly as this subcommittee drafts the bill that will fund the IRS for the next fiscal year. The alleged targeting of conservative organizations applying for tax-exempt status is a shameful violation of the intent of the Constitution. I'm deeply offended, as I'm sure all Americans are, at the notion that a federal agency can somehow pass judgment on an entire group of people simply based on their political affiliation. This activity is even more egregious because the agency, the IRS, has such power to ruin the lives of every American. We will not tolerate another political enemies list. We've been there before. Having an enemies list harkens back to a dark page in our past. And the arrogance of power that we've seen from those involved in this instance is deeply, deeply disconcerting. Furthermore, I'm absolutely appalled at the apparent waste of taxpayer dollars on frivolous conferences outlined in Mr. George's forthcoming report. In no way, shape, or form is this kind of excess ever appropriate. This bureaucratic largesse is even more unsettling as we face budget shortfalls across the board in critical areas of government, including our own national defense. It seems we have a new misstep every day at the IRS. I'm very troubled at what may come to light next. So we've got to take every step possible to figure out how we can stop this kind of abuse in its tracks. And Mr. Commissioner, you're the man. We're in the middle of some very grim budget times. We simply cannot allow the IRS or anyone else to waste precious tax dollars on improper practices, maybe even illegal, that treat Americans unequally for any reason, or on frivolous activities or improper tax refunds, of which I'm told there's some 13 billion. When we provide you with more than 10 billion annually to fulfill your duties, we expect you to spend it wisely and effectively. Commissioner Werfel, I know you've already publicly stated that these conferences were inappropriate uses of taxpayer dollars, and that you intend to root out any other inappropriate behavior at the IRS. And I hope that this committee works with you to review how we can prevent spending like this from ever happening again. Mr. Chairman, we may want to consider putting conditions on your funding that allow us to monitor your agency's compliance with proper practices. This committee's done that before, and we very well may be in that mode again. My committee already has and will continue to enact tough measures and oversight at other agencies, as we did with the GAO, to root out this kind of excess and abuse. If it takes legislation to stop these latest misguided endeavors, so be it. That's all we'll do. This agency, allegedly an independent agency, should operate in a non-political, fair way to every American. That rule has been violated. We look forward to your testimony and your answers, more importantly, to members' questions, to help this subcommittee provide the vigorous oversight necessary to prevent bad actors from running amok. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Lowy, who is the ranking member of the full committee, for any remarks she might like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to join you in welcoming Acting Commissioner Werfel and J. Russell George here today. We thank you and we look forward to your testimony. And I'd like to thank again Chairman Crenshaw and Ranking Member Serrano for holding this very important hearing. We know that the IRS is the first line of defense in ensuring that hard-earned tax dollars of American citizens are appropriately handled. And as my colleagues have said, I join them in such shock that news that millions of dollars were unnecessarily spent on conferences, videos, senseless purchases, such as baseball tickets, presidential suites, along with allegations that the IRS targeted ideological groups for increased scrutiny, raised serious questions regarding whether the IRS is properly working for the people. I, like so many citizens, am quite simply wondering, what was the IRS thinking? What on earth were they thinking? It is truly amazing to me. And I'm furious that the IRS engaged in ideological scrutiny, which is absolutely unacceptable. We have a responsibility to the American people to make sure this is rectified and does not happen again. Our nation was founded on the principles of freedom of speech and expression. No position or party has a monopoly in our public debate or government. The IRS should never be used for any activities that come close to partisan or political action, period. The IRS's responsibility to evaluate applications for tax-exempt status, frankly, has been lost in this debate. A dramatic increase in the number of 501c4 organizations will lead to more reviews, but those reviews should never target one part of the ideological spectrum over others. And in this hearing, I know we all want to hear what went wrong, what steps are being taken to prevent similar practices in the future. And again, I'd like to thank Acting Commissioner Werfel and Inspector General George for being here today. Commissioner Werfel, I know you've been in this position for a matter of weeks, did not manage the IRS or the division in question during the time of these improper activities. So I appreciate your assistance and hope that this hearing helps to get to the bottom of this issue. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Mr. Werfel. If you could limit your statement to 5 minutes or less, it'll give us more time for questions, and we'll be happy to submit your written statement for the record.
Thank you. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the work we are doing to chart a path forward for the IRS. This is obviously a difficult time for the agency, and the public is rightly concerned and upset, as am I, about the inappropriate and unacceptable actions highlighted in the recent Inspector General's report regarding the 501c4 application process. Working together, though, I am confident that we can address the problems that exist and move forward with a better and more effective IRS. With that in mind, in my first few days, I have initiated a comprehensive review of the agency and have taken immediate actions to begin to address significant and alarming problems identified in the report. In taking these steps, I am guided by several principles. First, we will ensure that we operate with the utmost fairness and impartiality in administering and enforcing the nation's tax laws. Second, we will be open and transparent with the American people. And third, we will operate in close consultation and cooperation with the Inspector General and Congress. Adhering to these principles will ensure that we always act with the best interests of the taxpayers in mind. Although additional investigations are underway that will shed further light on what happened with the 501c4 application process, I have reached an inescapable conclusion about the behavior described in the IG's report. The use of certain political labels to determine how applications would be handled resulted in applications being inappropriately singled out for additional scrutiny. Moreover, there was a fundamental failure by IRS management to prevent this inconsistent treatment and ensure that it was halted once management became aware. These failures have undermined the public's trust in the IRS's ability to administer the tax laws in a fair and impartial manner, and they must be corrected. The agency stands ready to confront the problems that occurred, hold accountable those who acted inappropriately, be open about what happened, and permanently fix these problems so that such missteps do not occur again. Clearly, ensuring full accountability for the actions taken and the management failures that allowed them to occur must be one of our first orders of business. That is why there is new leadership at several critical levels of the managerial chain of command. We now have new leadership in the Commissioner's Office, and we have new leaders carrying out the duties of the Deputy Commissioner for Services and Enforcement, the Commissioner of Tax-Exempt and Government Entities, and the Director of Exempt Organizations. While this new leadership is in place, a critical area where we are turning our attention is the unacceptably large backlog of applications for 501c4 status, focusing initially on the quote-unquote potential political cases referenced in the IG report that are more than 120 days old. Some of these applications are 400 or 500 days old. That is simply unacceptable. I have directed my team to submit a plan to me by the end of this week that contains specific milestones for expeditiously resolving this group of cases. I have also made clear that these applications must be examined in a manner consistent with the IG recommendations so that the reviews, while thorough, are also fair and impartial. I've further instructed my team to work swiftly to ensure that all 9 of the recommendations in the IG report are fully implemented. I have asked to receive at minimum weekly updates on their progress, and I intend to regularly update the public both on this effort and the progress being made to eliminate the backlog of applications. I'm also reviewing the broad spectrum of IRS operations, processes, and practices to focus on how we deliver our mission today and how we can make improvements in the future. In that way, we will develop a better understanding of organizational risks wherever they exist within the IRS. For example, in line with the IG report to be published this week on conference expenditures, we must ensure that we continue to have the right controls and oversight in place to prevent wasteful or inappropriate spending, and this in other areas. Wherever we find management failures or breakdowns in internal controls, we will move to correct these problems quickly and in a robust manner. We will report to the President, the Treasury Secretary, and the public by the end of the month about our progress on all of these efforts. We have a great deal of work ahead of us to review and correct the serious problems that have occurred at the IRS and continue the important work of the agency on behalf of taxpayers. In the few days that I have been at the IRS, it has already become clear to me that this agency is populated by thousands of dedicated public servants who are strongly committed to carrying out the agency's mission. It is an honor for me to serve alongside them, and I am confident that together with Congress and other external stakeholders, we will address the current challenges and move forward with the indispensable work of this agency. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Serrano, this concludes my testimony. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Now we'll turn to J. Russell George, Inspector General, for any opening remarks he'd like to make.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our audit recommendations concerning the Internal Revenue Service's treatment of groups that apply for tax-exempt status. As you know, our audit was initiated based on concerns expressed regarding taxpayer allegations that they were subjected to unfair treatment by the IRS. Our review confirmed that the IRS targeted specific groups applying for tax-exempt status. It delayed the processing of these groups' applications, and it also requested unnecessary information from these groups. To its credit, during our audit, the IRS took some actions to address these problem areas. The IRS corrected the inappropriate criteria for selecting applications for additional scrutiny as potential political cases in May 2012. The revised criteria focused on indicators of significant political campaign intervention, not on names or policy positions. These revisions were still in place in December 2012 at the end of our audit fieldwork. The IRS also put 2 new controls in place by having exempt organizations' headquarters in Washington, D.C. involved in reviewing all criteria included on the quote, "be on the lookout," unquote listing, and in reviewing all letters requesting additional information for potential political cases. However, we identified other areas needing improvement. We reviewed 2 statistical samples of the Internal Revenue Code Section 501c4 applications and estimate that the Determinations Unit Specialist did not identify more than 175 applications with indications of significant campaign intervention that should have been referred to the team of specialists for review. Furthermore, of the 296 potential political cases we reviewed, almost 1/3, 91 cases, did not contain indications of significant campaign intervention in the case file. As noted, we made 9 recommendations in our report. The IRS should formalize its new requirement for an exempt organization's executive to approve all criteria on the Be on the Lookout listing. The IRS plans to incorporate this requirement in its manual by September 30th of this year. The IRS should require the specialist document the specific reasons why applications are chosen for review for potential political cases. The IRS informed us that it would review its screening procedures and determine what documentation can be implemented by September 30th of this year. The IRS should develop a process for formally requesting assistance from the exempt organization's technical unit to ensure that requests are responded to timely. The IRS indicated that it will develop a formal process by June 30th of this year. The IRS should provide oversight to ensure open cases are approved or denied expeditiously. The IRS agreed to closely oversee the remaining open cases as of April 30th of this year. However, it did not provide a date for completing the cases. The IRS should recommend to the Department of the Treasury that guidance on how to measure the, quote, primary activity, unquote, of social welfare organizations be considered. The IRS agreed to share this recommendation with its chief counsel and the Treasury's Office of Tax Policy by May 3rd of this year. The IRS should provide training and guidance in 4 areas. First, properly identifying applications requiring additional review of campaign intervention activities. Second, processing applications for tax-exempt status involving potential campaign intervention. Third, understanding what constitutes campaign intervention. And fourth, requesting additional information and how to word the questions. The IRS plans to develop a schedule by January 31st, 2014 to provide the staff the recommended training. In closing, the IRS still has work to do to resolve these troubling allegations and to ensure that they do not happen again. We plan to conduct additional audits to assess the IRS's progress in addressing our recommendations. We also plan to review how the IRS monitors social welfare, agricultural, labor, and business league organizations to ensure that political campaign intervention does not constitute their primary activity. TICTA is also continuing to look into whether any violations of the Internal Revenue Service Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998 have occurred, and if any inappropriate influence caused the change in criteria and the unnecessary questions posed to applicants. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, thank you for the invitation to provide my perspective on this issue.
Well, thank you very much. Thank both of you all for your testimony. We're going to turn to questions from the members of the subcommittee, and I'm going to recognize the members in order of seniority who were here when the hearing started, and then I'll recognize those in order in which they appeared, and we'll go from side to side. So let me start out. Let me ask you, Mr. Warfield, it's good to hear your perspective because you're the new guy. I think if you add them up, you've been here 12 days. That's probably counting weekends, and you've probably been working on the weekends. And in another 18 days, you're expected to give a kind of your first look at a 30-day review of what's going on here. And I think we've all looked at the facts, and we recognize that what has happened here has really shaken the trust of the American people in the IRS and its ability to be fair and impartial. And as I said earlier, I think you have to have a fair and impartial agency that's going to collect taxes when you base the collections on volunteerism. People voluntarily pay their taxes, but they need to be able to trust the agency that's collecting those taxes. And one of the problems I have found is that this went on for some time, and yet no one spoke up. Now, there's some question, is this some rogue agents in Cincinnati? It's hard to believe that somebody just stood up one day and said, hey, here's a way we can really embarrass people that are of a particular political philosophy. But we're trying to figure out what happened. And I know you want to figure out what happened. And then you're going to conduct a top-to-bottom review of that. But one of the problems, too, we've had is that we never get straight answers. The story seems to change from time to time. The facts seem to change from time to time. And I think that's why we all want to work with you to find out what happened. And most importantly, we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. And we want to help us all figure out some way that we can restore the trust of the American people in the IRS. Because as you know, and most people are just now realizing, the IRS is going to be the face of this new Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare. It's the IRS that's going to be charged with making sure that people have insurance. Not only do they have insurance, they have the right type of insurance. And when they don't have the right type of insurance, the IRS is going to be the agency to say we're going to collect a penalty, collect a fine. And so it seems to me more important than ever before. We're in a critical time. We got to do everything we can do to make sure that we let people know that you can trust the IRS, that they're going to be fair and impartial, and that's what you want to do. So let me start by just asking you, do you feel like the IRS has betrayed the trust of the American people?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I think that's why I'm thinking about this in terms of my primary mission is to restore that trust. And I'm hopeful that by the end of this hearing today, through the various questions that you ask, that I can lay out our approach. But I think it has to start with a recognition that the trust has been violated. And it has to start with a recognition that we have to get all the facts out. Part of this process of restoring the trust, it's a multi-step process. But you start with making sure that you're getting those facts out, that you're understanding who needs to be held accountable for the breakdowns that occurred or the missteps that occurred that led to that violation of trust. We have to fix the problem. Part of the fact-finding is not only to get to the accountability element, is to understand the root causes of what caused this breakdown to occur, because that's going to help us fix it and put in the right controls and processes to make sure it never happens again. And then I don't think it's smart to stop there. And I think that this type of problem, and when you look at the conference report that just came out, it shows that there are other issues throughout the IRS, other control issues, managerial oversight issues that we need to thoroughly look at and start bringing into the public light. And I'm planning to work very closely with the Inspector General on this to make sure that we have an understanding across the entire agency. Where are the weaknesses and how do we fix them? And it's really not just me and the Inspector General. It's a partnership with Congress.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I do think that bad news doesn't get better when time goes by. And I think we're committed to trying to find out what went on and let those facts lead us where they lead us. But let me just ask you one more question. And I'm glad to hear you say that you do believe that the trust of the American people have been betrayed, because it seems fairly obvious. But I want to ask you if you're willing to cooperate fully with these congressional investigations that are going on so that we can find out what went on and, again, restore the trust that the American people need to have.
Absolutely. You have my commitment for full cooperation.
Well, thank you very much. Now I will turn to Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask you a question that may sound easy, but if analyzed, I think it's a more tougher question than it would sound. I can assure you that there are many members of Congress who would like to map out the future of the IRS. You're not one of the most popular agencies now. You never were, but you're certainly not one of the more popular ones now. And so rather than doing that, we on this committee are charged with a special responsibility. We have to allocate dollars, and then we also have to make sure that those dollars are spent properly. Others may just comment on how those dollars are spent, but we have to come up with those dollars and then oversee those dollars in many ways. So my questions to you is, what concrete steps that we on this committee, Appropriations Committee, can take to prevent this sort of inappropriate activity from happening again? I'm giving you an opportunity, both of you, to tell this committee what can be done by us to make sure this doesn't happen again.
I'll start. I think first, holding hearings like this, asking us the right questions to make sure that there's transparency from both the Inspector General and the IRS in terms of the facts and circumstances that were in existence when this happened. Helping us evaluate what the right fixes are. I mean, I've only been there for a few days, and when I start to dig into this issue around how do you appropriately set up a C4 review process, there aren't a lot of easy answers in terms of making sure it's set up right. That doesn't mean we're not going to find those answers. We will. But it strikes me that trying to find those answers just within the IRS in an insular way is definitely not the right answer. We have to surface these issues. There's experts sitting across from me right now in terms of the IRS and how it operates. There's experts in the Inspector General's office. There's external experts that have been looking at and evaluating the IRS for years. We need to bring these people together and sort through what the issues are. And since we're sitting here in front of the appropriators, I think it makes sense to talk about funding. And one of the important points I want to make is that the solution here is, in my opinion, not more money. The solution here in this situation is to understand what controls need to be put in place, what oversight, what getting the right leadership in place, the right processes in a collective way. And then determining what the resource footprint that's needed to sustain those in an effective way. If you start with more money, it's the wrong starting point. The right starting point has to be, what is the optimal footprint or framework for doing this right? Then we sit down and we figure out what the resource allocation is. And that's what I offer to you, is I think the right way to analyze the situation. And I'm very open and eager to work with you on that.
Mr. Serrano, as our audit concluded, what happened in this instance was a result of gross mismanagement of a key program, a key function of the Internal Revenue Service. That said, I associate myself with the comments that the Commissioner indicated. I would add to that something that Chairman Rogers indicated, conditions on funding, regular reports to the committees of jurisdiction, in this instance, the House Appropriations Committee, for the IRS to regularly report, how they expended their funds, and of course the oversight responsibilities that the Inspector General's office has in addition to that type of activity.
So you both would welcome or not oppose a deeper oversight role by the Appropriations Committee in this particular case?
I think it's very important that occurs, sir.
And when you say gross mismanagement, and I close with this, Mr. Chairman, was that mismanagement as reported in the press, or as some have said, one that targeted groups based on what those groups believed in? Or do you believe that it was so mismanaged that it didn't care who it held up or who it asked silly questions of?
Sir, it's for me, I could not give you a definitive answer at this time because there is an ongoing review of this matter by my organization and others, obviously, on this. But there is no question that there is a little of both in this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Werfel, I'm beginning to like you when you say you don't want more money. That's music to my ears, and I'm sure the chairman feels the same. Now, in addition to the $50 million for conferences over the last 3 years, the press is reporting that the IRS paid out more than $92 million in bonuses during that 3-year period. And within that sum, key figures in the current scandal got bonuses. Sarah Hall Ingram, the former commissioner of the tax-exempt and government entities division, which was responsible for overseeing the 501c4 applications, received bonuses of $103,000 plus, which increased during the period of the increased scrutiny of these conservative groups. And in addition to that, she was promoted now to head up the IRS involvement with Obamacare. Joseph Grant, former Deputy Commissioner of Tax Exempt, 3 bonuses, almost $84,000, same period of time. Lois Lerner, Director of the Exempt Organizations Division, given $42,000 in bonuses during that period. And all of these had to be approved by the President. Isn't that right?
My understanding is there is a small subclass of bonuses called Presidential Rank Awards that are approved by the President, but they're relatively small in number. There's maybe a couple of hundred throughout the entire government. The larger amount of bonuses in terms of quantity are typically approved by the agency head.
But OPM's guidelines say that bonuses over $25,000 have to be approved by the President. Yeah. So did the President approve these bonuses of these very critical people in this scandal that we're investigating?
I'm not sure the answer to that question. I'm also not sure from the way you phrased the question if the bonus totals that you articulated were individual bonuses that added up to those numbers, or if there was an individual bonus that exceeded $25,000. But that's something we can certainly look into and get back to you.
Would you let me know?
Yes.
Now, looking forward, how do we set up criteria for the awarding of promotions and bonuses to employees at a time when every other federal employee's pay is frozen?
This is a very important question, and as I look at the situation and we see the type of gross mismanagement that Inspector General spoke about, and then you layer on top of that the existence of bonuses in this area, it speaks to a larger issue that we have within the IRS to improve our overall management oversight. And that includes not just making sure that we understand where the weaknesses are, making sure that our people are adequately trained. It relates to compensation and fairness as well, and this has to be part of the review.
If these people receive these bonuses and by OPM's guidelines were required to be approved by the president, and he did not approve them, should they not pay those bonuses back?
That's a question that I'd have to go back and talk to HR experts and others, but certainly we can get an answer.
Will you get back to me on that?
I will.
Mr. George?
Mr. Chairman, I would just note that my organization is conducting we have an ongoing audit on the issue of bonuses paid at the Internal Revenue Service that is due sometime this fall. And we will certainly share those results with this committee and with you.
Now, switching gears briefly, one scandal to another. Mr. George, it was your report that the IRS had overpaid low-income tax credits by up to $13.6 billion in 1 year, 2012. When Secretary Lew was before this subcommittee in late April, I made clear to him in no uncertain terms that this was unacceptable. That sum is more than the entire budget of the IRS. What steps are being taken, Mr. George, to tackle that problem?
Sir, this is one of the most intractable problems confronting the Internal Revenue Service. Refundable tax credits, which again are credits that can be paid to people who do not have tax obligations, once the money is out the door, it is extremely difficult for the Internal Revenue Service to collect it. And then I will defer to the Commissioner to define their procedures and the policies, but they conduct a cost-benefit analysis, and in many instances, it's more expensive for them to go after those who've gamed the system or cheated the system than to, in effect, write it off. And we're just talking one instance in terms of the earned income tax credit, the additional child tax credit, the child tax credit, among many other credits. This is a very, very difficult issue for the IRS to confront, and it's a long-standing one, sir. This is something that Congress has been looking at for decades.
Well, this is not a small problem. This is a huge amount of money. It's more than the budget of the entire agency, as I said. Has anyone been fired over this?
Not to my knowledge.
Mr. Werfel?
Not to my knowledge.
Will they be?
Again, on this particular question of improper refund payments, if I could, if you can indulge me, I think one of the causes of these improper payments orients around the complexity of the code and the complexity of the eligibility criteria. If you look at, for example, the earned income tax credit, one of the things that we look at in terms of to determine eligibility is whether the individual has lived with their dependent child for more than 6 months or not. That's one of the criteria. That is extremely difficult to validate. We don't have a global childhood residency database. It's very difficult to validate. When we go in and we check on things, we find mistakes. I think to answer your question in terms of whether anyone should be fired, it really goes to the question of whether any of those payments were paid out advertently in error versus inadvertently in error. If there is some underlying malfeasance associated with these improper payments, then certainly. But in most cases, and this is an area that several guiding principles to me, such as operate in good faith.
So he did not order you to terminate, clean house, or hold anyone accountable? Just to restore this?
He and Secretary Lew gave me a first assignment. They asked for a plan, again, which I'm prepared to provide by the end of this month. And in that plan, there were 3 aspects to it. And that first aspect was get to the bottom of this and hold the appropriate people accountable. So that's the way the instruction was framed.
Regardless of whether the president asked you to or not, do you plan on clearing house, terminating anyone, or holding anyone accountable?
I certainly plan on holding people accountable. I don't know that
What
we
is
have...
what is your definition of accountable?
So it's a good question. Here's where we are right now in the process. We have an audit report that the Inspector General provided, and that audit report has conclusions about mismanagement. And so the first part of the review is to figure out whether any of that mismanagement would lead one to the conclusion that that individual can no longer hold a position of public trust in the IRS. And that's my first
You've
order of
already
business.
stated publicly that the public trust has been lost. You've stated that in the beginning of this meeting.
Right.
You also have stated that to the chairman's question, if somebody has done something wrong, would you terminate them? And it was in accordance to the refundable tax credits. And you said advertently, if somebody knowingly, advertently, and intentionally does it, yes, you would fire them. So we know that something has occurred here, and yet we hear there's this long review process, and yet no one has been held accountable. So for the committee, has anyone to date been held accountable?
Well, let me answer your question this way. If you look at the IRS
That's a
organization...
yes or no. Has anyone been held accountable?
I would say yes, and then I'd like to expand on that. If you look at the IRS organization today versus the day the IG report was issued, we have new leadership in the Commissioner's Office, Deputy Commissioner for Services and Enforcement, Commissioner for Tax-Exempt and Government Entities, and in the exempt organization.
That is new leadership, but who has been held accountable?
Well, I think the leaders that were replaced, certainly I think the fact that they're no longer holding positions of public trust, that's part of the accountability. The critical point here...
Terminated?
In most cases resigned.
Voluntarily, or were they asked to resign?
It's a combination, but for example, Steve Miller was asked to resign.
So resignation is accountability? Is that what you're telling the American people?
Well, here's what I'm
Lois
saying.
Lerner being on administrative leave is accountability. Is Lois Lerner still being paid today?
She is.
Is that your definition of accountability?
Well, if you'd indulge me just to answer the question
That's
again.
an easy yes or no.
There's two stages to accountability here. The first stage is based on the facts we have now to determine who can no longer hold a position of trust within the IRS. And the second stage, which I know is where you're going, is to determine whether there was any underlying malfeasance or issues that would warrant dismissal. We're going to follow the facts where they take us. We just do not yet have that completed review. Inspector General...
If you don't know that there's underlying malfeasance, then why was somebody asked to resign?
Because the decision was made that that person could no longer hold a position of public trust because of the failures of management oversight. Whether those failures were motivated by something...
So they were asked to resign just to restore public trust for public perception purposes, or maybe political purposes.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that when there's a breakdown in management, when there's gross mismanagement, you have to make tough decisions about whether that person can continue to hold their position of trust.
One last question, Mr. Chairman. I know it's my time's expiring. Have either of you asked the individuals in Cincinnati who ordered this, who ordered them to use this extra scrutiny to punish or penalize or postpone or deny? Has that question been asked of any employee?
Yeah, during our audit, Congressman, we did pose that question, and no one would acknowledge who, if anyone, provided that direction.
So no one would acknowledge who gave the directive to do this?
That's correct. And
Next
that question,
question
our
has been asked.
question during the audit phase of this.
Mr. Warfel, are you satisfied with that
No.
response from the individuals in Cincinnati? Will
No.
you get to the bottom of that?
We have to get to the bottom of that. I completely agree.
No matter how high it goes up the chain, you will find out who made this order.
We will uncover every fact.
Thank you. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Acting Commissioner, let me ask you the same line of question in a different way. In a sense, what you're suggesting is that accountability is going to happen, but there is a process to it that requires some time and investigation.
That's exactly right. We have to do this fairly and thoroughly, but I, like everyone else, I'm frustrated too. I want these facts to emerge quickly.
It's a complicated process and a complicated Byzantine process that took place to get us here, correct?
It's a complicated process, yes.
And in as much as the anger exists and the anger is justified, without knowing exactly what took place, it's hard to find people accountable in the correct way. If you don't know exactly what happened and who ordered what and who did what, it's hard to immediately find people accountable if the word of fire and so forth and prosecute and investigate is there. It's just going to take a little bit of time, correct?
It's exactly right. We have to get the facts in a fair and thorough way.
Listen, the chairman began this hearing talking about scandals and people being embarrassed and how far this is. You know, it's hard to shock and awe someone who's from Chicago, Illinois about scandals. My last two previous governors either went to jail or in jail. Two of my last four predecessors sitting in my seat are in jail or went to jail. So I get it. But this is getting there, and clearly this makes... I'm often asked what the real cost of corruption is. Clearly there's a loss of trust here. That loss of trust is probably the greatest thing because it makes it very difficult to lead when you don't have the public's trust. So, gentlemen, that's your task. Ms. George, let me just, in ours to follow up, let me just ask you this. And I know your agency is the one that brought out this stuff about collected and wasted. Is there some sense that it took too long to get this out and to catch the other scandal that's involved here? In a sense that if we didn't catch it before, how do we know we can prevent it again in the future?
That's a very good question, sir. We are the ones who have to respond to allegations. You can only be so proactive, especially in the context of the tax code that the law will allow. And unless someone brings to your attention an instance of malfeasance or what have you, there's very little that you can do, again, proactively to address it. So, for example, in this instance, members of Congress, as well as media reports, brought to our attention allegations that certain groups were being targeted by the IRS. In the instance of the report that we'll be releasing tomorrow on conferences, it was a whistleblower within the Internal Revenue Service who brought that matter to our attention. So you can only do so much in this type of a circumstance, sir.
Any comment, Ms. Warhol?
You know, I think it's incumbent upon organizations, in particular public sector organizations, to ensure that they have the right controls, management, leadership processes to surface.
You would agree it shouldn't take a whistleblower, right?
It should not. It should not.
Someone should be reviewing these conferences on an ongoing basis to see if they're really appropriate.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons learned that's going to emerge out of this process is we need a much more sophisticated risk management and control structure within the IRS. That's clear based on what happened here and obviously some of the emerging issues coming out of Mr. George's office.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, congratulations on your new position. Certainly we have our work cut out for us here.
Yes.
I wanted to start with some questioning related to the tense we're using in terms of past tense or current regarding the targeting of specific political groups.
Yes.
Most of this hearing has been about the actions that have occurred, the audits that were put in place, the delays, the obstruction that was put in place for groups of Americans that essentially wanted to exercise their First Amendment rights. How many Americans, how many groups of Americans continue to have their applications delayed? How many groups continue to be held under unjust, unconstitutional scrutiny by the IRS as of today?
It's a question that I want the answer to as well. And what we're doing is initiating as quickly and as efficiently as possible a review of the IRS across the entire IRS to see if there's any common elements of impartiality in other parts that occurred in this particular area.
But not just in other parts. How many groups have applied for 501c4 status, some of which in the Inspector General's report had been over 2 years, now over 3 years had applied, that are still at the IRS today waiting to have their applications approved or denied, or at least some answer. Now, I know you've been on there 12 days, but over the past weeks, as this has come about and become acknowledged, and frankly, since IRS officials were alerted to this over a year ago, many of these groups continue to have their applications denied. And so we talk about this today in this hearing here in Washington, D.C., as if this is something that has occurred and we're going to investigate and we'll hold those who did this accountable. But, sir, your agency, the IRS, continues today to deny and block the constitutional rights of Americans as we sit here, this very moment. How many Americans are having their constitutional rights blocked as of this afternoon?
I don't know that a conclusion has been raised on constitutional rights. I think there is a legal review being undertaken by the Justice Department. But to give you an answer to your question, there are 132 cases that are in this grouping of potential political advocacy that are referenced in the IG report. 132 cases in that grouping that have not been acted upon in over 120 days, which by IRS definition is overdue. And as I said earlier, I have directed new leadership that's heading exempt organizations, TEGE, and our new Chief Risk Officer, David Fish, who comes from GAO. I've directed them to submit to me by the end of this week, and I will share that with you, a plan with specific milestones for how we're going to knock out that backlog quickly and effectively.
You mentioned 120 days. How many of these groups have been in application process for more than 2 years?
It's a number I don't have at my fingertips, but there are groups, and it's unacceptable.
It seems like if there's 132, that would be something we could simply identify. Is that something you can provide for the committee today?
Absolutely.
Okay, you can do that by close of business today to inform us how many groups are waiting over 2 years to have their applications approved.
Yeah, I think we have that data and we can provide it to you.
Mr. Inspector, do you have any information relevant to this?
I do, sir, but it says it's somewhat dated because it's as of the end of our audit. And so as of December 17th of last year, of the 296 cases that we identified in that political category, 160, which is roughly 54%, were open from 206 to 1,138 calendar days. And then 129 of the 160 open cases have been open for more than 1 year as of December of 2012.
Commissioner Warfel, one of the reasons this is such an important topic to this committee in particular is because these questions were asked of then Commissioner Schulman in March of 2012. And he assured the committee at that time that there were built-in safeguards, there was a culture and tone at the top, and people knew it would not be tolerated. Today we're having an opportunity to go through this same experience, but going forward, we want to know that the positions you take today, that the statements we make are accurate and they're based upon fact. Clearly, Mr. Schulman did not know, either misled the committee or knew it, didn't tell the committee the truth, but either way, the facts were not presented to the committee to that day. We've heard there have been at least comments made that the audit division could potentially be engaging in similar practices. Do you have any awareness or any reason to believe, and can you investigate whether the audit division has targeted individuals specifically for audits based upon donations or engagement in conservative political activities, or any political activities?
Let me answer that directly. I'm not aware of any such behavior. I've initiated a review to answer that very question, and if I find anything that is similar in scope to what is in this Inspector General report, I will make you aware.
Inspector, did you find anything related to this in your review?
We have not conducted a review in this area, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mrs. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. Let me begin with this, Inspector General. Some media outlets have been reporting that the IRS was targeting conservative groups for political purposes. Your report contradicts that claim. Could you please comment on if you found any political motivation in reviewing tax-exempt applications?
Congressman, let me respond to your question in the following way. When we looked at the 298, well, there were 298 cases which were put into a category for political activities. We were able to look at 296 of them because 2 didn't contain enough information for us to base a review on. We were able to identify roughly 79 that were definitely put to the side because they had Tea Party, 912, and Patriot in the name of the group. The vast majority of the other organizations, their names were so innocuous that we did not deem it, possible to determine whether or not they were conservative groups or whether or not they were, groups that might be on the other side of the political spectrum. And so this is something that we are continuing to look at, but in the instance of the political activity matter, we did not uncover instances of groups that could readily be identified as being, liberal, for lack of a better term, that were treated in the manner that the Tea Party cases were.
In your report, there's quite a pie chart that shows that the vast majority of groups that were investigated did not fall into the so-called conservative category. Am I reading the chart correctly?
You are, because they were not by the title of the organization readily identifiable.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right, now let me say this. In 2010, there was a Supreme Court ruling, Citizens United, that allowed unlimited amounts of money, as you well know, to be assembled for political campaigns, many times by secret donors that don't have to disclose under Section 501c4. I'm wondering, an organization that incorporates has many options if they want to engage in civic life, and then if they move into donations to campaigns, they could have incorporated as a 527. We've had many groups that do that, but you were looking at 501c4s. Am I correct? This is the Cincinnati office apparently was looking at 50. Why might an organization choose to incorporate under 501c4 rather than 527 if they're political? If their intent is political?
I have no idea.
Well, it's interesting because they don't have to disclose donors. And so it's very interesting to me that if one looks, and I'm going to ask you for the record of the organizations that you were looking at there, after the Citizens United ruling, how much did your applications increase in the 501c4 category, did you say? I think Congresswoman Lowy, Ranking Member Lowy.
I have that information. In 2010, the number of C4 applications was 1,735. In 2012, it was 3,357.
Yes. It's very interesting trends here, and there isn't a person up here that doesn't understand what's going on politically in this country, and the hidden nature of what is affecting campaigns today that is very unlike what many of us faced when we first were engaged in political life. Yes, sir.
Okay, I just want to elaborate. Of the groups, the 298 that were put into that political category that were singled out for specialized treatment, not all were C4s. Some were 501c3s also. So they were singled out for treatment, which may or may not have been justified if had...
What percentage would you guess were 501c4s? 78?
Well, 89 of 298 were 501c3s.
So the majority were 501c4s?
That yes.
Were any 527s?
Not to my knowledge.
Very interesting. How many, of that group that you specifically investigated, what number approximately fell into the Tea Party, 9/11, however that is described, that so-called super conservative group?
Yes. One moment, please. There were 72 Tea Party groups, or there were 13 groups that were identified under the Patriot category, and there were 11 that were identified under the 9/12 category.
Thank you for providing that to the record. Why the Cincinnati office? That happens to be in my home state. I mean, was this a specific assignment of that office?
The Cincinnati office is where the determinations unit is housed, and they have the responsibility to do the 501c review process for incoming applications.
For the whole country?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Although in this instance, there were a few IRS employees located outside of Cincinnati who also engaged.
That's correct. As a general matter, most of the work happens in Cincinnati in this unit.
All right, I'm going to ask Mr. Chairman, as these gentlemen provide information for the record, I'm very interested in knowing if the definition of political in 501c3, C4, or 527 is inadequate, and if there is some rubber language in there that allowed for perhaps some miscalculation. I don't know, but I'm looking at the changes in the law and what's happened to us as a country, and the fact that you've had so many more applications in that category is at a time when our economy is not doing that well. So I'm interested in which of those groups that are applying would have a political nature of that. You said 3,357, the additional ones.
They'll get you that information. So,
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Diaz-Balart. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Werfel, I must tell you that I am grateful for your willingness to do this, because I guess some people would say the smart thing to do would be to just run away. And so, seriously, exceedingly grateful for your willingness to now jump in under very difficult circumstances.
Thank you.
Mr. Quigley mentioned, that he's not usually in shock and awe of corruption, I believe is what he said, and that this one may do that. Mismanagement or incompetence or missteps or corruption are frankly always destructive, and unacceptable. I will tell you, and maybe this is just because I represent a constituency, a very diverse constituency that come from countries where the government targets people for their beliefs. I think this is worse. As dangerous, as unacceptable as those that I just mentioned are, and they are, when government targets individuals for their beliefs, this is now an affront on democracy, on our freedoms. And I just wanted to see if you thought that I was exaggerating in my understanding of how dangerous, how unacceptable this issue can be.
I agree with you. It's completely inexcusable, and it's inherently damaging. In particular, now that I've been at the IRS for a few days, I recognize that this important agency is founded on a principle of operating impartially, and we failed in that most basic core principle here. And it's devastating to us as an agency and to the people in that agency. They are very, very upset and appalled by this as well. I mean, that's a story I don't think that has been told, is that the people in the IRS, many of which, and most of which I would articulate are hardworking, are appalled. The one point I would raise to you, and this is frustrating for everyone involved, is that more analysis and investigation is going to be needed to understand what motivated, if anything, this behavior. What were the circumstances surrounding it? And we have to get to the bottom of that. And then I think we can fully better understand the problem. But on its face, I agree, it's completely inexcusable, and it is a violation of that fundamental tenet of the IRS, which the people take so seriously, and it's very upsetting.
Well, and I would just, not putting words in your mouth, but I would say not only the IRS, but frankly, it's basically it's the basis of our country, that you should not fear the government because of your beliefs. So,
I totally agree with that.
And again, so I thank you for your willingness to do this. Now, some people are going to talk about funding, and I think that's a bit of a joke. You already mentioned that you don't think that more money is now the way to do it. I think whether it's the 220 conferences for employees between 2010 and 2012 would state that funding doesn't seem to be a problem, or the bonuses that the chairman mentioned doesn't seem that funding is an issue. I think people are going to also talk about legislation and all sorts of different excuses. Now, you now have a choice to make. And I'm optimistic that you're going to, because you've agreed to take this on, that you're going to make the right choice. But the choices are very simple. You can either try to change the story and cover this up and try to give it a good spin, or you can make sure that you get to the bottom of it, that people are held accountable, that proposals are made to make sure that in the future, this is more difficult to do, and I know that's already starting, and that the American people have a clear understanding when this is said and done as to who did and ordered what and for what reason. And I just wanted to obviously, I trust that you're going to do the right thing. But the right thing means absolute
transparency. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And two reactions, if I could. One is, as I've gotten to the IRS and started to learn, and I came in with this notion is that we have to be completely open in everything we do. I quickly got a briefing on Section 6103 and realized that there are certain, we're getting these congressional requests in. I want to push information out as quickly and as expediently as possible to you so we can get to the bottom of this. But then I'm learning that before we send that information up, we have to review it for the 6103 to protect taxpayer information. So my commitment on transparency is absolute within the legal abilities I have. And then if I could, I need to make a clarification on the budget. The point that I was making, and we haven't gotten to that yet, and if we don't get to it, that's fine. The president's budget is out there. I'm prepared to defend the increases that we're asking for because I think they have important return on investment benefits to the taxpayer. With respect to this exempt organizations unit, the point I was making was it would be a mistake for me to come in and ask for more money as the solution. The right answer is for us to figure out what the right processes are and then figure out what the budget necessary to sustain that. It could be the same, it could be less, it could be more. But the chairman started this hearing by saying, how can we give another dime? And my answer is, let's explore together what's going on in this process and figure out what the right funding is. But I can't come in here and say we need more money for that aspect of IRS operations without working with you on the review. And that's what I meant.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Woolman.
I thank the chairman and I thank the gentleman for their testimony today. Mr. George, you've been inspecting the IRS for now the better part of 10
About 8 years, sir.
You've been through a lot of inspections. Characterize for me and for this panel your relationship up to this point with the service you inspect.
It's a symbiotic relationship, sir, in many respects. I mean, while there's no question that we have
I'm not taking any consequences off the table.
Has the White House suggested that there are certain consequences that should be taken off the table for any individual or individuals
I'm not aware of any.
deemed to be involved?
I'm not aware of any such statement.
Has the Treasury Department asked you to take any potential consequences off the table for any of the perpetrators involved in this process?
No.
Now or known or to be discovered through the investigation process?
I think the key is the job to do is to get the facts and then figure out together, collectively. Again, I want to go back to my earlier point, and it's a point that in response to Mr. Congressman Yoder's question, are we going to find similar problems? Are we going to realize what happened here? And the question is, it's a mistake if that process unfolds in the IRS alone. We have to figure out a mechanism to make sure that as we discover issues and concerns within the IRS, it's not discovered just within IRS. We're doing it collectively. So I think the question is, and I've asked the chairman about this, I need to be able to call, to convene meetings, to give periodic updates about what we're finding so that we can collectively determine what the right answer is and analyze these facts. And because I think as we get more facts, we're going to have to figure out what happened. And it's not going to be an easy analysis, but it's one I think we can do collectively.
Are you prepared for the worst possible outcomes? That there may be a universe of people, a large number of IRS employees caught in this in this process that have culpability?
I'm prepared to follow the facts wherever they take us. I think it's the only way to restore the trust.
I thank the gentleman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know my time has expired.
Thank you very much, and I think we'll have time for another round of questions. And so let me start, Mr. Warfel, because on one hand, I'm encouraged by what you say, that you want to follow the facts where they lead, and you want to hold people accountable. Because I think that's what we all want to know. What happened? But it seems to me that it's not just mismanagement. You can argue that the $50 million that somebody spent on conferences and videos, that's gross mismanagement. But when an entire office of the IRS somehow begins to single out conservative groups and bully them and harass them, and it occurs to me that common sense tells you that just doesn't happen. That's not bad management. That's somebody gone wrong. And quite frankly, sir, if that office just got together and somehow people started doing this, and as I said earlier, and nobody spoke up. I mean, if you've got a lot of people watching this abuse take place and nobody speaks up and says, this isn't right. Well, and if that's all there is, in other words, if somebody didn't say, here's a plan, go do that, that they just did that, that scares me more than anything. It's like there's this culture of intimidation that people got together and they're just doing that, and nobody steps up and says, this is wrong. Now, that's what I think we all want to figure out. Did this just happen? Or did somewhere along the way somebody give some direction? Because I think that's what accountability is, to find out somebody that's responsible. I don't know if anybody came up with this plan or not, but it just doesn't seem reasonable that it just happened, that people just said, oh, and all of a sudden you look back and say, for the last 3 years, we've been picking on people that happen to have a conservative philosophy. So I'm concerned about when I hear you say, well, we just want to kind of uncover the mismanagement or the whatever. So here's my question. If you're going to be there 120 days, now what do you want to happen when you leave 120 days from now? What do you want? What do you want to be able to report to us?
Those are all good questions. Let me start with following the facts, because that statement needs to be backed up by the realities of what's going on. We have the Inspector General conducting additional investigation, following up the audit. We have the Justice Department investigating, and we have congressional overseers, and then there's my review with my leadership team. So there's 4 separate reviews. Critical to that is making sure that we are supporting one another and reinforcing one another to get this information. I'm not sure right now, I can't give you an answer in terms of what the world looks like in terms of 120 days from now, what we've uncovered. I know that we've already started sending responses and information back to congressional committees based on questions that we've received. I know that the Justice Department is actively engaged in investigation as of today and as of a few days ago. So the process is unfolding, and it's real. What's happening to uncover the facts is real, but it's going to be a process. And as I said before, it's frustrating that it's going to take time, but that process is underway, and for all intents and purposes, I anticipate that Mr. George and everyone else will ensure that that process is robust. I'm certainly going to do my job to make sure. What I want to get accomplished while I'm here is to initiate this plan, this roadmap, to talk with you and other committees and the American people about what that roadmap needs to look like. Or do we have the key ingredients around accountability, around fixing the problem, around the broader IRS review? My bottom line is...
At the end of the day, the best way to stop this is just to have it stopped. And so I'm asking you, who are you going to talk to? What kind of questions are you going to ask? You got all these people down there that were participating in what most people would say is really an absolute abuse of power, and it's going on. And nobody stood up and said, I don't think this is right. But somehow, some way, we found out that's what's going on. And so, are you going to talk to those folks and say, how did all this happen down here? I understand all these road maps and all those kind of things, but it seems like it's pretty simple. I'd go ask those people, say, look, how'd y'all decide to do this? Did somebody stand up on their desk one day, or did somebody send a memo from somewhere? I mean, it seems like that's, at the end of the day, we want to find out who's responsible. And I know you do too.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering how we do that, putting all these systems in place. It seems like there's some basic questions. That's why I want to know what you plan to do, who you're going to talk to, what kind of questions are you going to ask?
So let me answer that question and maybe ask Mr. George to talk about what he's doing. But the key is that there's a lot of people asking questions right now. The Justice Department, Mr. George's team, members of Congress. I'm asking questions as well. And what
kind of questions are you asking?
I'm asking my leadership team, for example, to evaluate the management breakdowns that took place. I want to understand, I'm asking them to initiate processes to ensure that the type of control breakdowns weren't occurring in other parts.
Are you asking your management team, like, why nobody on the management team watched what was going on and didn't say, is this right or wrong?
It's new leaders that have been put in place including, a top-ranking official from GAO that I brought over to help do this. I mean, I can walk through with you in great detail this plan and the roadmap. Part of it involves evaluating the audit report, a lot of good work done by Mr. George, which reveals certain elements of where the public trust was violated in terms of gross mismanagement. There's further questions to be asked, and the challenge that I have, and I want to talk through that challenge with this committee and with others, is that I have to make sure that I'm reinforcing and not stepping on the work of the Inspector General, the work of the Justice Department, and the Congressional Oversight Committees that are doing those interviews.
Well, I appreciate my time is up, but I just hope that it's either just kind of happened or somebody made it happen. And I hope we can figure that out. Now, Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I say this, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, because I'm not referring to you, but I think the gentlemen need to know, if they don't know already, that some folks in this Congress are not going to be satisfied until the President gets blamed directly for this taking place, when in fact, both of you have stated that this was gross mismanagement that created a problem. Now, there are some people that have written articles in different places that show different numbers. For instance, I have some figures that indicate that of the aggrieved, if you will, or the people that were further scrutinized, 46 were Tea Party or Patriots. 76 were clearly conservative. 6 could not be determined, and 48 were non-conservative groups. So let me be clear that my outrage is about anyone being targeted, if anyone was targeted, but I suspect that if anyone was targeted, it might have been right across the border, not necessarily one group. Secondly, and most importantly, in answers to Ms. Lowy, our ranking member, you, Mr. George, made it clear that there is no direction showing or any information showing that anyone gave an order to this. This is why you've called it gross mismanagement, because people can get caught up in thinking they're doing the right work and not do the right work at all. Now, again, for the record, if people were targeted, we need to know that eventually, and we will know that. But I think we're spending too much time trying to figure out if someone said do it, rather than why it was done and who did it. And I think that that's where we're wasting time, not necessarily today, but in general in this Congress. Now, can you repeat for us again what you said before? Is there anything in your audits that indicate that this was something that was set up at a larger level with more in mind than actually what we know happened?
Not in this audit, Congressman, but once again, we are continuing a review of this matter, and so
Right.
and we'll go wherever the facts take us.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Commissioner, you made some members of this committee extremely happy, and others just perplexed and made our work a little harder. You see, the easiest thing to tell this committee is, I don't want any more money. We had an agency that did that before. It's called the SEC. When I was chairman, they actually came before us and said, we don't need any more money. Then we found out why they didn't need any more money, because they were not interested in oversight, and that's part of the reason Wall Street and everything fell apart. And they kept telling us, we don't want any more money. And it was, I must tell you, and if you want to classify me as people were being classified here today, I guess as a liberal, I was saying, you sure you don't want any more money to go and do the work you're supposed to do? We don't want any more money. Then later we found out they didn't want oversight. Now, I'm sure that's not what you're saying,
No.
but please understand that there are consequences to the fact that we are cutting this budget, your budget, all the time. Your job is not only to find out what went wrong in this particular issue, working jointly with Mr. George, who, by the way, I have to commend you for coming back and back and back every time we invite you. One could say, well, you have to, but you could be sitting there not smiling at all, ever, and you do it with great grace. But there are other parts here. For instance, during the year, we will remind you to go find out who the tax cheats are. During the year, we will go and tell you to find out where missing dollars are that could come into the Treasury. During the year, we will tell you to make sure that people are not banking money overseas. All that costs money. And it's been proven that for every dollar you get, 7 are returned when there is no mismanagement. So what I'm saying to you is, a friendly advice, find another way of saying that you will get to the bottom of this without saying, don't give me any more money, because trust me, there are folks here who don't want to give you more money. In fact, there are some who would like to cut you to the bare bone.
So I appreciate the question and an opportunity to re-clarify again. My testimony is not that I'm not asking for any money. My testimony is A, that I'm prepared to defend the president's budget request because I think the increase in resources that we're requesting are going to have a very positive impact on the federal budget in terms of reducing refund fraud, reducing identity theft, improving overall taxpayer service. What I testified earlier was that with respect to whether there's a need for more money in the determinations unit process to solve the C4 issue, what I'm suggesting is before we answer that question, let's determine what the right approach is for C4 reviews and then align our budget to that right process.
Right.
It could be an increase, it could be level, or it could be less. That's all I'm suggesting because I wanted to erase any notion that I think this problem can be fixed just with more resources.
And in closing, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Commissioner, yes, in answer to a question, you said that there is money that goes out that maybe shouldn't be going out to people who don't deserve it. Those people usually, under that program, fall into a category of folks with very few resources. I'm not suggesting at all that if they don't deserve the money, they should be getting it. But I think that we should not go back to the days when 44% of the audits were being conducted on 17% of the people. Meaning that 44% of the audits at one time in this committee, in your agency, were being conducted on the EITC program, and the billionaires were not getting audited at all. So I would hope that as we go out to deal with what is fair and unjust and what is unfair, we also remember the mission of the IRS, which is to be fair to all taxpayers and to all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I thank you for that clarification. I think most people understand what you're saying, and I think you should be commended. Your first response is not everything gets solved with more money, and that's all he's trying to say. And I think you can look at the facts of this whole discussion about mismanagement. If it started in 2010, when the IRS got the most money they'd ever gotten, and they had less work to do, that doesn't make any sense. Maybe they had too much money. Maybe that's why the mismanagement started.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate his clarification. I appreciate your clarification. I just wanted my clarification to be clear that I've dealt with agencies that didn't want more money, and that's because they had no interest in oversight, which created the problems in Wall Street, I believe.
Thank you for your clarification of your clarification. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Rogers.
Well, the question of whether or not we want to need more money is academic anyway, because we ain't got no money. My friend Joe. Whether or not the denial of the applications of conservative groups was the product of a few rogue employees in Cincinnati, or whether or not it was directed from on high, is a matter of great importance. I'm sure you appreciate that. And that's the question that we want to track down. And Commissioner Werfel, you say you will follow the facts wherever they go. Well, we want you to push the facts to find out where the orders came from. Surely they did. I can't imagine two low-level employees taking on such a hefty political policy decision on their own. That just doesn't hold water, doesn't make sense. In fact, one of the junior agents told the investigators of the Oversight Committee of the House that he believes the order to target Tea Party groups came from the agency's Washington, D.C. office, and that it was impossible, he said, for the targeting of Tea Party groups to have originated with a few rogue agents in the Cincinnati office. He went on to describe how the agency's Washington office requested the files of specific Tea Party groups that contained their applications for tax exemption. It's widely believed that the D.C. office was closely involved in the targeting of these groups from the outset. It also suggests that the intrusive questions and inappropriate requests made of these applicants, some pro-life groups, most notably the Coalition of Life for Iowa, which an IRS agent reportedly asked to pledge not to protest outside of a Planned Parenthood office in exchange for granting tax exemption. That is completely unacceptable. Do you agree with that?
Well, let me start by saying I think your question enters into a particular taxpayer, and then therefore I'm restricted by 6003 from commenting on that particular. But yes, as a broader matter, those types of questions are, from my vantage point, and I know I'm early in the job, inexcusable.
There are numerous reports that we're hearing now from investigators who've talked to staff that have, I think, conclusively made the point that these orders came from on high, from Washington, D.C., from the internal headquarters office. Now, what we want to know is who gave the orders? Where did this come from? We will not rest, Mr. Werfel, until somebody gets us those answers, because that's terribly important to the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, on the funding. In the past, the committee has, when we had an agency that was not doing something that they were supposed to do, this committee would put conditions on the financing of that agency in installments, so that your money would not come until you do what you're supposed to do. That's a straitjacket. I don't like to do that, but we've done it with the Coast Guard and GAO and others. And it very well may be that the subcommittee may recommend to the full committee, and we may take it to the floor, the proposition that your funding will be conditional on your response to the questions that we're asking you. We will not rest until this is done, and I don't need to remind you or anyone else that the power of the purse rests in the Congress, and we're prepared to use that purse to get to the truth.
Thank you. Ms. Capter.
I've been listening to this testimony today and thinking a lot about 501c4 organizations. And I agree with the members on both sides of the aisle here who don't want to target any group based on political ideology or any kind of ideology. But I'll tell you, this 501c4 category is one that demands serious attention by the IRS. And I think because of the Supreme Court rulings, and perhaps because of insufficiencies in the law itself, what is deemed political and worthy of oversight is not well expressed, perhaps. Perhaps there's a shortcoming in the law. I would like to place on the record two articles, one from Forbes magazine and one from Mother Jones, that relate to one organization that I would guess is a 501c4, FreedomWorks, in which their top leader resigned last year, stating that it appeared to him that the leaders of the organization were trying to produce a book entitled Hostile Takeover, which would jeopardize the organization's C4 status. Now, obviously you can't give a lot of information here today about the hundreds of organizations you've looked at, but just on the hunch that there might have been some smart people working in the Cincinnati office who were concerned that there were a lot of new 501c4 filings in this country, and that there have been tax cheats in the history of this country, that maybe somebody over there at IRS was actually doing their job. And though your testimony can't reflect any of that, I'd like to say I believe that there might be some of those people over there. And that, in fact, if they were trying to find people who wanted to be hidden donors and not be on record, then I think the American people ought to take a second look at this. And you can't state a lot in your testimony today, but Inspector General, you listed a couple things here in your testimony. Inappropriate criteria were developed and stayed in place for a total of more than 18 months. Of course, you don't say what those inappropriate criteria were. You talk about substantial delays in processing. Most Americans got their refund in time this year, despite the almost $1 billion that was taken away from IRS. I think a lot of people at IRS are working very hard. And then there were unnecessary information requests. Well, if you're trying to figure out who secret donors are, and if an organization is really a 501c4 and not overstepping its boundaries under the spirit of the law, maybe there might be some delays. So I'm asking myself some questions after listening to you and reading your testimony and finding that I need more that isn't in there. So let me ask you, of the hundreds of organizations that you've reviewed, will any of those names be available for the record, or are those hidden to the public?
Title 26, Section 6103 places very severe limitations on who we can reveal taxpayer information to. It's limited to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. They and the chairman of the Joint Tax Committee. They in turn can share that information with various members of their committees. But they too have restrictions, limitations on who they can share taxpayer information with. So that is part of the reason why, Congresswoman, a lot of the names are not provided in our report.
I'm glad to have that clarification. I'm glad to know that the Constitution is working a little bit here. Let me ask you, Mr. Inspector General, some media outlets have been reporting that the IRS targeted only conservative organizations, and your report does not state that the organizations asked to provide additional information were only conservative groups. Consequently, is it correct to assume that organizations other than conservative organizations were inappropriately asked to provide additional information about their tax-exempt applications? And if so, approximately what percent of the total that were reviewed?
Percent, I will see if one of my colleagues can provide that information. But once again, Congresswoman, some of the groups that were identified in the 296 that we were able to look at, who were placed in this category of political activity, part of that group by name were agnostic. We couldn't tell one way or the other whether they were progressive, conservative, what have you. But of that 296 that we were able to examine who were placed in that category, 72 were identified as Tea Party, 13 were identified as patriot groups in their names, and 11 had the 9/12 date/name in their name.
So theoretically, some liberal groups could have been in the majority then
That is
of groups that were looked at.
Your time has expired. Please, let's recognize Mr. Graves. Thank you.
Following up on my last questions, Mr. Warfel, have you asked any of the employees in Cincinnati if they were ordered to carry out these targeted approaches?
Not at this time. I have not asked those questions yet.
Who interviewed you
Who interviewed me?
for this position?
I was first approached and asked about whether I would be interested in going over and helping the IRS by the White House Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough. He's the first person who approached me.
Did you ask the White House Chief of Staff who, in fact, had ordered these special targets here?
I did not. I wanted to make sure I understood what the mission was and what they were asking me to do.
So you were willing to take the post without knowing where it may go, what it involved, who was responsible for the scandal, and then you have yet to even go to Cincinnati and ask those employees who ordered it.
By way of background, I've been a civil servant in government for 16 years. I have deep respect for the civil servants across the federal government, including those at the IRS. The IRS is an agency in need right now. I have a reputation for stepping in and helping solve government problems. I took the job because I felt like I could be helpful. That's why I took the job.
Okay. Well, I think one way to be helpful would go to Cincinnati, find out who ordered them to carry out these targets. And then the earlier question to Mr. George, I think your response when I asked that to you was they did not respond or you did not get a response. Is that correct?
Yeah, oh, they did correct. They did not identify anyone who gave the order.
So you can infer then that either they took it upon themselves or they were hiding the identity of somebody else. Which would you conclude?
Well, at this stage, Congressman, I would say when we questioned them, it was in the guise of an audit. And the circumstances when you're conducting an audit, you're really looking at, institutional.
So this should be Mr. Warfel's first question then in Cincinnati is who gave you this order then? Understanding yours was more of an audit, his then is seeking out who actually made the call.
It could be, but this is an important fact that I do need to bring up, Congressman. We, working with the Department of Justice, are looking further into this matter. And if Mr. Werfel were to exert himself too much into the process, it might impact our ability and the Justice Department's ability to continue our review. So there are.
Mr. George, just change lines here a second. It's been reported recently that Senate Democrats at various times over the last 3 years had asked the IRS to intervene or look into the tax-exempt status of various groups. New York Times reported it. In March of last year, a group of Senate Democrats sent a letter asking the IRS to crack down on 501c4s, I guess sort of following up on Ms. Captor's concerns there. In the course of your investigation into the targeting of conservative groups and throughout all the interviews and all the employees, senior officials, others, did anyone indicate that they felt pressure from Senate Democrats?
Nothing in our audit has revealed that type of information, sir.
Have you seen any evidence at all?
I have not.
That the IRS reviews of tax-exempt status groups or tax-exempt groups requested by the Senate Democrats coincided in any way with the targeted groups that have been identified?
In the course of conducting the instant audit, no.
Do you anticipate that you will see?
We will go wherever the facts take us, sir.
I think truth is very important. As we all sit here today, it is about the truth, and I appreciate your focus on that as well. Fact-finding is very important. And so I'll just sort of conclude with two final questions. Mr. Warfel, do you agree that those that have been targeted are not political allies of the president?
Let me make sure I answer that question as directly as I can. I believe that certain applications were singled out based on inappropriate criteria. Based on the evidence that the audit provided, those applications were associated with conservative groups. I think one of the questions that have been raised, and I don't know the answer to it right now.
So a 9/12, a Tea Party.
Exactly.
A conservative group, is that an ally of the president, or would you consider that a political opponent?
I mean, I'll just offer as a lay person and a citizen, I would say that those are typically not allies of the president.
So they're political opponents. And would you agree then that Ms. Lerner, Mr. Shulman, Miller, senior staff that admitted knowing this information previously are subordinates of the president?
Yes, they are subordinates of the president.
And so therefore we can conclude then that they're either the president or the subordinates of the president were well aware of, were involved in the targeting of political opponents.
I don't know that I could jump to that conclusion. I think there's more analysis and review that needs to be done. I understand the question, and I understand the need to want to know the answer to that question. I think most we're asking for indulgence to make sure that we can review the facts and get the information that you and this committee needs to help answer those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this is quite a mystery. We've spent a couple hours now. There's been a hearing today. There's been hearings last week trying to determine how this came about. And I know there's been some conversation today that it's not necessarily relevant why these individuals took these actions. I think it's very, very relevant. And determining the motivation and determining the rationale is very critical to preventing this from ever happening again. And so as we go through this, what seems to be a mystery, we are left with the understanding that frontline employees, based upon their own volition, determined that they were going to scrutinize certain political groups based upon the ideology of those groups. And so I'd ask Mr. George, in your opinion, who gave the order for the IRS to target conservative groups?
I do not have an answer to that question yet. Again, we are engaged in ongoing work, and perhaps we'll be able to respond to that question.
In your conversations, in your interviews with the frontline employees that you have identified, did they express particular political animus towards conservative groups or any political groups?
I have not been engaged personally in those interviews, and nothing has been brought to my attention by those who have that is the case, sir.
Are we aware that they are overly politically active or attending rallies or are somehow embedded in the IRS because they personally, on their own volition, determined that they wanted to target specific groups?
I have no information on that, sir.
Well, because we're left with the conclusion that these folks are very politically active, yet people on Capitol Hill, the administration, they wouldn't be political at all. So somehow career line, frontline employees are the political scapegoats here, yet the folks in Washington, D.C., the folks who make policy, the folks who are very attuned to politics somehow disavow any knowledge or any engagement in this at all. Mr. George, did they express in any of the interviews that you're aware of any awareness of the letters coming from Capitol Hill or comments made by the President regarding specific conservative groups?
And your indulgence. That subject did not come up during our conversations thus far, sir.
In your investigation and your reviews, did you determine that the approximately 157 visits by then Commissioner Schulman to the White House had any impact on this policy to target conservative groups?
That was not a focus of the audit, sir, and that did not come to my attention until media or a congressional hearing at which that fact was revealed.
Has there been any investigation by your office, sir, as the independent investigator, related to any conversations that the White House or any upper-level officials in the administration had with IRS officials regarding the targeting of conservative groups?
Sir, that is a matter that it would fall under the aegis of this additional review that we're doing, and so I'm not at liberty to discuss that information at this time, sir.
Well, Mr. Werfel, given your quest for justice in this matter and your expressed desire to get to the bottom of this, we certainly look forward to and hope that your internal investigation will uncover what has occurred here, because it's certainly, I think, tragic and laughable to many Americans that this would somehow be laid at the feet of some frontline employees and that there would be no effort to push them in any way from the political arm of this administration. Given that your role is going to be internal, given that we have an investigation by the Inspector General that has not uncovered many of these conversations, we still don't know who gave the order. We don't really have any information regarding this. Would you welcome a special prosecutor or independent counsel to look into these matters?
I think right now, it's a good question. I think right now, as I mentioned, we have 4 layers of review ongoing. Justice and the FBI, the Inspector General, Congressional Oversight Committees, and myself and my new leadership team. My position right now is that that is, I believe, currently a sufficient footprint of oversight and investigation to uncover the facts. What I would suggest is we let that process move forward as expediently and as fairly and as thoroughly as possible, and revisit the question on a periodic basis. Is that footprint of investigation getting the job done?
But would you object to a special prosecutor or independent counsel being moved forward?
I'm not the decision maker on that. Whatever is decided in terms of necessary investigation footprint, I will be cooperative and welcome any investigation. But as I said, right now there's 4 layers of investigation, and what I would suggest is let's monitor that. Some of it has just gotten underway. Let's monitor that and see if we're getting the progress that this committee's demanding, and then revisit.
And that's fair, Commissioner, and certainly you're brand new to this position, 12 days in. I will tell you that for those of us who've been on this committee and been working on what appear to be a lack of accountability on many different fronts with this administration, whether it be Fast and Furious, Benghazi, AP phone records, or now the IRS situation, I think the idea that we would somehow trust that the administration can internally investigate these matters and successfully root out the cause, you're going to have to understand there's going to be a healthy dose of skepticism, and many of us would like to see an independent investigation of these beyond the administration. So we'll hope we have your cooperation on that, and we hope we'll do everything we can to get your support to get to the bottom of this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Millard.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. These three C3 and C4 reviews, how long do they usually, in a normal process, without this, how long does that usually take?
That's a good question, and my understanding is that Once it's longer than 120 days, we would characterize it as longer than what the IRS expects the process to run, but I don't know the average at my fingertips. We can certainly get you that.
Do you have any idea of what would be a quick one? You know, what would be a fast one?
I don't, but I can get you that information.
Well, just because Mr. George, in your report, you talk a lot about, and I understand why you explained it, about this being basically ineffective or gross mismanagement. Now, if it was consistent, I would understand that. But if it's on one side, it would seem that you have very effective management, in this case to the Obama Foundation, while at the same time you have ineffective management when it goes to conservative groups. I don't know if I would. This is just me personally. I don't know if I would call that ineffective management. I mean, that seems to be targeted. Is it not?
Well, again, in this instance, the reason we deem it ineffective management is because when identified by the manager that there was a problem, she attempted, or did actually, affect change, and let it just, unbeknownst to her, we assume at this stage, people reverted back to the inappropriate behavior. And then there seems to have been, for quite a while, a lack of accountability in terms of someone going back to see whether, hey, are they doing what we told them to do? And the answer was no for quite a while. And then, of course, the groups that were targeted in this instance. So that's how I come about to use of the term
and I understand that. You've been very clear with that. But again, when you have it on the other side, and I don't know how many of these cases there are, but when the Obama Foundation gets taken care of in 1 month and then retroactively, this seems more than just by omission. This took somebody to take action to do. And the pulling out these conservative groups, it took somebody actually doing it. So it actually was an action that was required. And again, that's why it's so troubling. But this is another point that I have. The C3 and C4 reviews, is it fair to say it's a pretty standard part of what the IRS does, correct?
That is correct.
And they do this quite a bit, and so if on something that's pretty basic, pretty standard, at best, it's gross mismanagement. At best, it is, and at worst, it's frankly a lot deeper than that. Could you tell me how I should feel good about giving the IRS now a totally new, complicated, above and beyond, now dealing with our health care, the ACA, or what is commonly known as Obamacare. Could you just, how do I tell my constituents, hey, on something that's pretty basic, look what's going on, but don't worry about it. Because now we're going to give the IRS, that we know we have all these issues, we're going to give them now, in essence, control of a big part of our health care, and they will be able to determine who gets fined and who doesn't. Could you please tell me how I should be able to feel good about that?
I can say that you can feel good about it in this way, sir. We at TIGTA have conducted 2 audits thus far, looking at the steps that the Internal Revenue Service is taking to prepare for the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And thus far, our reviews have been positive that the IRS is doing what it needs to do in order to gear up for this. That said, the IRS has to create many, many new computer programs, and historically they've had trouble instituting new computer programs for implementing tax law changes. So that is a risk. And in all candor, unless the IRS receives additional resources in order to implement the ACA, it's a zero-sum game. They're going to have to make very difficult choices in terms of customer service, in terms of enforcement, in order to take on this huge responsibility that they've been presented with.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, time is up.
Well, and one of the things they could do, when we learned that the money that was wasted on the conferences and the videos came from the unused portions that was appropriated for enforcement, while the Enforcement Division was demanding more money. That tells us that IRS, just like every other agency, can be more efficient, more effective. But you all have been very generous with your time. Mr. Warfel, Mr. George, thank you for being here today.